On a Tuesday morning in March, the principal of Riverside Elementary walked into a building that had been empty for exactly 3 years, and she wept. Not the quiet, private kind of weeping that dissolves into composure. This was the kind that shook her shoulders, that made her grip the railing of the central staircase, that left her unable to see the faded bulletin boards and dusty trophy cases through the blur of her tears. Rebecca Santos had been a principal for 17 years. She had handled budget cuts, overcrowding, the overwhelming politicization of education in America, parent complaints that ranged from the reasonable to the absurd. She had never, in all that time, allowed herself to cry in a school building. But this wasn't like the others. This building had been waiting for her. Riverside Elementary had closed on June 15th, 3 years prior, when the school district of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, announced a consolidation initiative. The school had served the same neighborhood for 63 years. 4 generations of families had walked through its doors. The building itself, a sturdy brick structure built in 1961, had seen presidents elected and assassinated, wars begin and end, and the entire landscape of American childhood transformed from something simple and structured into something fragmented and complex, and then, just like that, it was deemed inefficient. The consolidation had seemed logical on paper. Millbrook's population was declining. Suburban flight had accelerated in the late 2000s as families chased new developments and newer schools. Riverside's enrollment had dropped from a peak of 487 students in 1998 to just 184 by 2019. The district office calculated that they could save $3.2 million over 5 years by closing 3 schools, including Riverside, and redistributing the students to 3 other elementary buildings in the system. The math was sound. The narrative was compelling. Efficiency, fiscal responsibility, forward-thinking administration. What the spreadsheets did not capture was what happened to a generation of children in the aftermath. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The children of Riverside Elementary didn't all leave at once. Some graduated before the closure was announced. Some had already moved away as their families fled the aging neighborhood for the promising developments that sprawled across the outer edges of town. But approximately 134 children, those in grades K through 4 during the final year, faced what the district office called a transition. Miguel Reyes was 9 years old when he learned his school was closing. His mother brought him to the meeting where the district superintendent announced the consolidation plan. He remembers the superintendent's name, Dr. Patricia Whitmore, and he remembers the way she smiled when she explained how students would have access to superior facilities and enhanced programming. Miguel's school didn't have enhanced programming. It had Mrs. Chun's art class, which took place in a room that used to be a storage closet, and Mr. Patterson's music room, where the piano was so out of tune that every song sounded like it was being played underwater. But Mrs. Chun knew Miguel's name. Mr. Patterson had taught his older sister 10 years ago. Those teachers knew his mother. They called her by her first name. They knew his father had died the year before. On Miguel's last day at Riverside, Mrs. Chun gave all the students in her class a small notebook and asked them to draw one thing they wanted to remember about the school. Miguel drew the big oak tree in the courtyard where he and his best friend David played foursquare at recess. He drew it precisely, the way he had learned to do, with the gnarled trunk and the branches that seemed to reach in all directions at once. Mrs. Chun told him she would remember him, and she meant it in a way that stayed with him. When Miguel arrived at his new school, Brookside Elementary, on August 12th, he walked into a building with 487 students, nearly 3 times as many as Riverside had ever held. The hallways were crowded. The classes were larger. No one knew his name. No one knew about his father. In the chaos of redistribution, Miguel was assigned to Mrs. Kessler's fourth-grade class, a room where the desks were arranged in rows, and the teacher competent, professional, good at her job, had simply too many faces to recognize. 134 children from Riverside fed into the system. Some landed at Brookside, like Miguel. Some went to Lincoln Elementary across town, and others to Franklin. The district had carefully calculated that no single school would receive so many Riverside students that the transition would be noticeable. This was, in fact, mentioned as a feature of the plan. The students would be dispersed, integrated, allowed to emerge naturally into their new communities. What actually happened was that 134 children became invisible. Myra Patel was a teacher. She had taught third grade at Riverside for 12 years. And when the school closed, she had nowhere to go. The district had offered her a position at Brookside, but at a significantly reduced salary due to seniority restructuring. She had interviewed at 3 other schools and been turned down in favor of cheaper, newer teachers, fresh out of college. By August, she was looking for work outside of education, a decision that took her completely out of the profession. But before she left, Mayra did something that would, without her knowing it, begin to document what was happening. She created a private Facebook group called Riverside Forever and invited every parent she could find. Within a week, 52 families had joined. They shared photos of their children's Riverside memories, class pictures, field trip photos, videos of school plays. They mourned together in the casual way that people do on social media, with emojis and exclamation points and longer posts that people wrote at midnight when they couldn't sleep. One mother, Jennifer Wu, wrote, "My daughter Emma cried for 2 weeks before starting at her new school. She said she didn't know anyone there. She said the hallways were too loud. Now it's September, and she comes home and says nothing happened at school. Nothing interesting, nothing at all. Her grades are fine. Her teachers say she's doing well. But something is broken." Another parent, James Osborne, wrote, "My son has anxiety. His new teacher is wonderful, but she has 28 students. At Riverside, there were 19. He's been having panic attacks in the bathroom." A third parent, Carol Martin, simply posted a photo of her son standing in front of Riverside's empty entrance on the last day of school, holding a sign that said, "I don't want to forget." But the data had been impossible to ignore entirely. And when a particular subset of Riverside students, those who were now 8th and 9th graders, began to show signs of serious disengagement, it occurred to someone in the district office that perhaps bringing back Riverside as a dedicated learning center for struggling students might address multiple problems at once. It would provide a small, supportive environment for students who were floundering. It would give them a sense of continuity and community. And it would serve the current efficiency mandate by utilizing a building that was otherwise sitting empty and depreciating. Rebecca Santos had been hired to run this center. She was told that she would have significant autonomy, that she could shape it into whatever the students needed, that this was an opportunity to be innovative. When she walked into the empty building on that March morning, what struck her most forcefully was the eerie sense of time that had stopped. Student artwork was still on the walls, faded now, curled at the edges. The hallways smelled the way they had always smelled, a mixture of floor wax and chalk dust, and the particular, indefinable scent of children. Dusty sunlight came through the high windows. There was a custodian's mop still in a bucket in the corner of the main hallway, positioned exactly as it must have been left on June 15th, 3 years ago. There were desks in the classrooms, rows of them, all facing toward where a teacher would stand. Rebecca walked slowly through the building, letting herself feel the full weight of what it meant. She thought about the children who had been moved away from here, scattered across the district, absorbed into larger systems. She thought about what Dr. Eleanor Hayes had written, and she wept there in the empty hallway, because she suddenly understood something about the problem she had been hired to solve. The students she would be serving were not broken. They were bereaved. On August 15th, when Riverside Learning Center opened for its first year of operation, there were 73 students enrolled. They ranged from 7th to 10th grade. They had been carefully selected by a committee to be students who would benefit from a smaller, more supportive learning environment, which was a euphemism for students who were behavioral problems, who had been identified as having learning disabilities, who were anxious depressed, who had trauma histories, who were struggling. This was actually an interesting cohort. These weren't the worst students in the district. They were the ones who had been identified as needing something different. Some of them had been identified correctly. A student with severe dyslexia, for instance, who needed specialized instruction. Others had been misidentified. A girl named Kaisha, for instance, had been flagged as having behavioral issues. But what she actually had was untreated ADHD and a complete inability to function in a classroom with 35 students. A boy named Tyler had been marked as learning disabled, when in fact he was profoundly intelligent, but was experiencing untreated depression. Rebecca had spent the month of July before the school opened interviewing each of these students. She asked them where they had come from, what schools they'd attended, what they remembered about those schools, what they struggled with, what made them feel safe, what adults they trusted. For about a quarter of the students, when she asked them where they'd come from, they said Riverside Elementary. Kaisha, who was now in 8th grade, said, "I remember it. I remember when I was in 3rd grade. I remember Mrs. Anderson. She was my teacher. She knew I was a mess even then. Like, I couldn't sit still, and I would blurt things out, and I was always getting in trouble. But she didn't make me feel like I was bad. She was like, 'Kaisha, you're smart, but your brain works different.' And I believed her. I believed that about myself. And then I went to Lincoln, and it was big, and nobody knew me. And suddenly, I wasn't smart anymore. I was just bad." A boy named Marcus, who was now in 9th grade, said, "My mom took me back to see it before they tore it down. I hadn't been there in 3 years, and I just stood there and cried. I couldn't even go inside. I felt like I would just disappear if I went back in there, like I would realize it had all been real, and I would just disappear." When Rebecca heard these stories, she realized something crucial. The students who had been displaced from Riverside didn't have an educational problem. They had a trauma problem. Not trauma in the sense of acute, traumatic events, though some of them had experienced that too, but a specific kind of trauma, institutional abandonment. They had been displaced from a place that had mattered to them, and that displacement had been framed as normal, as necessary, as not something to mourn or process, but simply something to accept and move on from. They had internalized the message implicit in the closure, that their sense of belonging didn't matter, that continuity wasn't important, that efficiency was more valuable than they were. And the problem was that this message had been absorbed into their sense of self at a critical time in their development. For children in elementary school, school is one of the primary systems in which they develop identity. Teachers are among the first adults outside the family who shape how children see themselves. And when that system suddenly disappears without explanation or processing, it leaves a particular kind of wound. Rebecca decided to address this directly. On the first day of the opening semester, she gathered all 73 students in the school's multi-purpose room, a space that was, ironically, much smaller than it had been in its previous incarnation, since she had only 73 students instead of 400. She told them the truth. She said, "I know that many of you have gone through school closures or transitions that were disruptive. I know that some of you went to Riverside Elementary, and I know that losing that school was hard. I know that you came to this district's schools, and it wasn't the same. And I want you to know that that matters. That loss is real. It's not something you need to just get over. It's not something that's your fault. And it's not something that this school is going to do to you again. These were not complaints. Not exactly. They were small confessions in a semi-public space. Testimonies to a loss that the district office would have categorized as adjustment difficulties or transition challenges. Normal experiences in the life of a school system. And they were normal, or they should have been. Children switch schools all the time. Closures happen. Districts consolidate. This is the modern reality of public education in America. But what happened at Riverside, and what happened in thousands of other school districts across the country following similar consolidations, was something that went largely unexamined and unresolved. It wasn't tracked in any systematic way. It didn't appear in the spreadsheets that justified the closures. It existed only in the private testimonies of parents and in the lived experiences of children who couldn't quite articulate what they had lost. The research literature on school closures is relatively sparse, which is surprising given how common they have become. In a 2018 report, the Economic Policy Institute found that over 1,000 public schools had closed in the United States since 2000. By 2024, that number had grown significantly. These closures were not evenly distributed. They disproportionately affected low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. Schools in wealthy suburbs rarely closed, even when enrollment declined, because wealthy parents mobilized politically to prevent it. Schools in declining urban neighborhoods or aging suburbs, like Millbrook, faced closure with far less organized resistance. The stated rationale was always economic. Schools were inefficient. They were underutilized. Money was wasted. Consolidation would free up resources that could be directed to instruction. The logic was compelling and made sense in the abstract. But in the actual, lived reality of what happened to children and families, the picture was more complicated. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, an education researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, had spent the last 15 years studying school closures. Her work was not widely known outside of academic circles, perhaps because it presented uncomfortable challenges to the efficiency logic that drove so many district decisions. In 2020, she published a longitudinal study tracking the academic and social outcomes of 847 students who had been displaced by school closures across 4 different districts between 2010 and 2015. Her primary finding was stark. Student academic achievement declined following displacement, particularly in the first year. This was true even when the students were transferred to schools with higher average test scores and more robust programming. The decline was most pronounced for students who had been identified as having social-emotional vulnerabilities or who had experienced recent trauma. But there was something even more troubling in her data. A subset of students, about 18% of those studied, experienced what Hayes called persistent disruption. These were students who struggled in their new schools, who began to disengage academically and socially, who accumulated behavioral incidents, and who, by their tracking into high school, showed markedly lower graduation rates than comparable students who had not been displaced. They were not the majority, but they existed in statistically significant numbers. Hayes had interviewed 30 of these students. The interviews were conducted over the phone or via Zoom, 5 years after their original displacement. When she asked them what they remembered about their school closures, they didn't talk much about academics. They talked about discontinuity, about the sudden absence of adults who knew them, about the disorientation of finding themselves in a larger school where they were nobody special, where their histories didn't matter. One student, Deshaun, who had been in 4th grade when his school closed, said, "It was like I disappeared. I was somebody at my old school. My teachers knew me. I was the kid who was good at math. I was friends with this group of people. And then one day, all of that was gone. And I was just in this big hallway with 400 other kids, and nobody knew me. And I wasn't good at anything anymore because I was too busy trying to figure out where the bathroom was." Another student, Alexandra, said, "My mom was sad about it. She cried. She had gone to that school. Her mom had gone to that school. So when they tore down the building 3 years later, yes, they tore down this old building, my mom cried again. And I remember thinking, this matters. This place matters to people I love. And then I was in this new place where nothing mattered, where we were just numbers, and I got the message very clearly that I was replaceable, that my connection to place was not important, that efficiency was more important than me. These interviews were part of a larger section in Hayes's book, titled The Psychological Cost of Consolidation, and they painted a picture that went beyond academic metrics. They suggested that something more fundamental was at stake when schools closed, something about children's sense of belonging, their understanding of their place in the world, their trust in institutional stability. When Rebecca Santos arrived at Riverside Elementary on that Tuesday morning in March, 3 years after the closure, she was there to open a temporary learning center. The Millbrook School District, like many districts across the country, had been reeling from the disruptions of the pandemic. In the 3 years since Riverside had closed, the district had consolidated again, closing another school and merging it with a third. Enrollment continued to decline, but now the district faced a different problem. They had too many buildings and not enough students, but too few classrooms and too many students. The logic that had seemed so sound in 2020 had inverted. By 2024, they had the opposite problem they'd anticipated. Additionally, and this was not discussed in the initial closure reports, the students who had been displaced from Riverside had not thrived in their new schools at the rates that had been predicted. Academic achievement had declined. Behavioral referrals had increased. A higher percentage of Riverside students had needed to be identified for special education services or behavioral support. The district couldn't find a satisfying explanation for this. It was certainly not attributed to the closure itself. That would have been an admission of error. Instead, it was attributed to the students some vague problem with the students, perhaps, or their families, or the neighborhoods they came from. I wish I could have come here when I was in elementary school, Miguel said to Rebecca one day. I think it would have made a difference. But I'm glad I can help now. The question of whether Riverside Learning Center had solved the problem was, ultimately, impossible to answer with absolute precision. The problem itself was diffuse and complex. The solution had been elegant in its simplicity. Take the students who were struggling, provide them with small classes, caring teachers, and institutional stability, but its effectiveness could not be reduced to a single metric. What could be said with certainty was this: the 73 students who had entered Riverside Learning Center in its first year had, as a group, shown significant improvement. By the end of their second year, almost all of them were passing their classes. By their third year, the vast majority had moved into advanced academic tracks or specialized programs based on their interests. None of them had dropped out of school. None had become involved in the juvenile justice system. None had what might be called a crisis. But more importantly, when asked about their experience at Riverside Learning Center, students consistently used language about belonging, about being known, about trust, about feeling safe. These were not academic metrics. They were relational and emotional outcomes. And they seemed, from a developmental perspective, to matter more than test scores. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, when she learned about Riverside Learning Center, asked to conduct a research study there. Rebecca agreed. Over the course of 2 years, Hayes interviewed the students, conducted classroom observations, and gathered academic and behavioral data. She presented her preliminary findings at a conference in 2026, and those findings received significant attention. What Hayes found was this: students who had been displaced by school closures and who later experienced a consistently caring institutional environment showed stronger recovery trajectories than those who did not. The recovery was not instant or without setback, but it was real. And the strength of the recovery was proportional to the consistency and quality of the relational support they received. In her presentation, Hayes showed data comparing Riverside Learning Center students to a control group of students with similar demographics and initial challenges who had remained in larger school settings. The Riverside students showed higher graduation rates, higher college attendance rates, and lower rates of behavioral referrals. But more tellingly, when interviewed, they described their school experience in fundamentally different ways. They talked about having a place, having people who knew them, having somewhere to belong. The control group, by contrast, used language about getting through, surviving, staying out of trouble. The institutional posture they described was fundamentally about endurance and evasion, not engagement and growth. There is a particular kind of loss that occurs when institutions close without adequate processing or transition. It is not the kind of loss that can be easily quantified or addressed through policy solutions. It is the loss of a child's sense that their existence matters, that their connections are honored, that they belong. For the students of Riverside Elementary, this loss was compounded by the particular historical moment in which the closure occurred. The early 2020s were a time of significant disruption in American education and life more broadly. Families were uprooted. Communities were fractured. The pandemic arrived just 3 years after Riverside closed, and by that point, an entire cohort of children had already experienced one significant institutional rupture. When schools shut down again in March 2020, some of these students experienced it as a confirmation of what they had already learned, that institutions were unstable, that communities could be dissolved, that nothing could be counted on to persist. The pandemic illuminated something that had been largely invisible in the research literature on school closures. When schools closed for remote learning, it was not just an academic disruption. It was a social and emotional rupture, particularly for children who had already experienced displacement and loss of community. Students like Miguel, who had finally begun to feel grounded after being scattered across the district, found themselves isolated at home again. Students like Kaisha, who had been thriving in a small, relational environment, suddenly found themselves trying to navigate online learning with an ADHD diagnosis and a family situation that was chaotic during lockdown. The research on the pandemic's impact on student learning and mental health has been extensive and largely pessimistic. There were significant declines in academic achievement, particularly for students in high-poverty schools and students of color. There were significant increases in anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation among adolescents. Schools reported unprecedented levels of behavioral challenges when students returned to in-person learning. All of this has been well documented. What has been less documented is the interaction between pandemic disruption and prior institutional displacement. But the evidence suggests that the students who had already experienced loss of community in the form of school closures were particularly vulnerable to the isolation and disruption of remote learning. Rebecca Santos made a critical decision when schools closed in March 2020. Rather than simply pivoting to remote learning like most schools, she decided that Riverside Learning Center would prioritize in-person connection for any students who needed it. She had space. She had a dedicated staff. She could do it safely. And she knew that the students in her building would be devastated by isolation. For the entire spring of 2020, Riverside Learning Center remained open for in-person learning, even as the rest of the district moved to remote instruction. Students could come to the building, sit in small groups or individually with teachers, receive the instruction they needed. The state regulations were ambiguous enough that this was technically allowed, though it was controversial. Some parents were terrified of the virus and pulled their children out. But most of the families at Riverside Learning Center chose to have their children attend in person. What happened in that spring and the following year, when other schools opened and closed again, when the district was in chaos, when so much was uncertain, was that Riverside Learning Center became a kind of sanctuary. It was a place where students knew they would see the same teacher, have the same spot, be expected and welcomed. Kaisha remembered this period with clarity. When everything shut down and everyone was freaking out, she said in an interview years later, Riverside stayed open. I would come in and Mrs. Chun would be there. Mr. Patterson would be there. Rebecca would greet me by name. There were like 5 of us in the building, and we were all trying to figure out what was happening in the world. But at least I knew I wasn't alone. At least I had my people. This decision to keep the building open had costs. Some staff members chose not to come in because of virus concerns. There were logistical challenges. And there was the constant anxiety of wondering if they were making the right choice. But looking back, it became clear that this decision had been crucial. While the rest of the district was fractured by pandemic learning disruption, Riverside Learning Center maintained continuity. The students had a place to go. They had adults who knew them. They had stability in a moment when everything else was chaos. The pandemic, in a strange way, validated the entire premise of Riverside Learning Center. It demonstrated, in real time, the importance of small, stable, relational institutions in the lives of children. It showed what happened when that stability was present and what happened when it was absent. In the years following the pandemic, as schools reopened and tried to return to some semblance of normal, the research on school closures began to take on new dimensions. A second cohort of research, conducted primarily by sociologists and anthropologists rather than education researchers, began to look at school closures not just as educational events, but as events with community-level implications. Scholars like James Foreman Jr. and David Stovall examined school closures as part of a broader pattern of disinvestment in particular communities. When multiple schools closed in a neighborhood within a short period of time, it sent a message about which communities mattered and which didn't. It was a form of institutional abandonment. One particularly powerful study, published in 2023, examined demographic patterns of school closures across the United States. The researchers found that between 2000 and 2022, schools in low-income, predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods were nearly 3 times as likely to close as schools in affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods, even when controlling for enrollment decline. The pattern was so clear that it suggested something beyond simple efficiency. It suggested policy choice, a choice about which communities were worth maintaining and which were not. In Millbrook, specifically, Riverside Elementary had served a neighborhood that was about 60% Latino and 40% Black, with a median household income below the district average. The 3 schools that had closed in the consolidation had all been in similar neighborhoods. The schools that remained, and even thrived, were in more affluent areas of the district. This pattern had not been intentional necessarily. No one had explicitly said, "We're going to close the schools in the poor neighborhoods," but the outcome was the same. The message received by families in these neighborhoods was clear. Your community is not a priority. Your children are not important enough to keep this school open. We are willing to uproot your children and scatter them across the district in the name of efficiency, but we're not willing to do the same to wealthy families in their neighborhoods. By 2024, when Riverside Learning Center had been operating for 3 years, and the full impact of the pandemic disruptions was becoming clearer, the question of what had happened to the lost generation, the students displaced by the original Riverside closure, had become a point of public conversation. Miguel Reyes, by this point a college freshman studying education, wrote an op-ed for the local newspaper about his experience. He titled it, "The School That Made Me Disappear," and in it, he described what it had felt like to be a 4th grader who suddenly lost his school, his teacher, his community of friends. He described the anxiety and confusion of arriving at a much larger school where no one knew him. He described the years of struggling academically and behaviorally, not because he wasn't capable, but because he didn't have the relational support he needed. He also described what it had meant when Riverside Learning Center opened, when he was able to return to that building and help other students navigate what he had experienced. He described how that return had been transformative for him, how being able to give back to a place that had once given him so much had helped him heal. The op-ed went viral on local social media. It sparked conversation about school closures, about community, about what we owe to children. It was picked up by education journalists, and within a few weeks, Miguel's story had been featured in articles in regional education publications, and then in national outlets. One particular piece, published in The Atlantic, examined Riverside Learning Center as a case study in what the author called relational pedagogy as a response to institutional trauma. The article reached a wide audience and seemed to crystallize something that many people had been sensing, but not quite articulating, that the dominant efficiency-based model of school consolidation and standardization had costs that couldn't be reduced to test scores or fiscal budgets. The article ended with this passage: Riverside Learning Center in a small Pennsylvania suburb may seem like a small story. 73 students in a building that used to house 400. But it is a story about something much larger, about what we lose when we treat children as units to be processed rather than humans to be known, about what happens when we close schools not because they are failing, but because they are inefficient, about what a child needs in order to thrive, and whether we as a society are willing to provide it. The success of Riverside Learning Center began to spark interest among other districts. Rebecca Santos started receiving calls from administrators in other parts of the country who were interested in replicating the model. She was invited to speak at education conferences. Universities contacted her about collaborating on research. She became, somewhat reluctantly, a public figure in educational reform conversations. But Rebecca was careful about how she talked about the school. She resisted the impulse to present Riverside Learning Center as a solution to the problem of school closures, because she was clear about something. The real solution was not to close schools in the first place. What we've done here is important, she said in a talk to district administrators. But we've done it to repair damage. And damage repair is always more expensive and less effective than prevention. The better solution is to not close schools, to maintain small schools in communities that need them, to invest in community-based education rather than consolidating it all into fewer, larger institutions. This was not the message that many district administrators wanted to hear. The consolidation and efficiency model had become deeply embedded in how educational systems thought about themselves. The idea of closing a school and consolidating it elsewhere seemed, in financial and administrative terms, to be the obviously rational choice. The idea of maintaining a small school in a less affluent neighborhood seemed inefficient, even irrational. She paused and looked at them. "This school will not close while you're here," she said. "I'm making that promise to you now, and I'm promising that you will have stability. You will have teachers who know you. You will have continuity. This building will be here. I will be here. For as long as you're in this school, this will be a place that belongs to you." Later, she would realize that this promise was, in a legal and administrative sense, something she couldn't actually make. The district could close the school if they wanted to. But what she was trying to convey was something different. She was trying to name the problem and acknowledge its legitimacy. She was trying to reestablish a basic social contract between the school and the students, that their presence mattered, that the relationship would be honored, that they belonged. It was a small gesture, but for many of the students, it was the first time an adult had explicitly acknowledged what had happened to them as something real. The research on resilience in children suggests that one of the most powerful protective factors is the presence of a consistent adult who believes in them. This is sometimes called relational resilience, the ability of a child to bounce back from adversity when embedded in a relationship with someone who sees them clearly and holds a positive vision of their future. By this measure, Riverside Learning Center was, from its inception, a deeply relational space. Rebecca hired teachers carefully. She looked for people who could teach content, but she looked even more for people who could be present. She hired Ms. Tanaka, who had previously worked at an alternative school for students with significant behavioral challenges, and who had a gift for reframing behavior as communication. She hired Mr. Dorn, who had been teaching for 28 years and had a kind of gruff warmth that students responded to. She hired Ms. Fernandez, a former social worker who brought deep training in trauma-informed practices. And she hired Mr. Patterson. Mr. Patterson had been the music teacher at Riverside Elementary. He had not been part of the consolidation because his position had been eliminated entirely. Music was not considered essential in the era of efficiency. He had been teaching private lessons and substituting for the last 3 years, working as a barista part-time to pay his bills. When Rebecca called him and asked if he'd be interested in being the art and music teacher at the new learning center, he wept on the phone. Mr. Patterson walked into the building on the first day with his guitar and a smile that hadn't been on his face in 3 years. He opened the music room, the same room where he had taught before, with the out-of-tune piano, and he brought in some new instruments he had bought with his own money. He put up a sign that said, "Music Room. All instruments welcome. Come make some noise." On the first day, no students came to the music room. Mr. Patterson sat there, thinking that perhaps music wasn't something these students connected with. But on the second day, Marcus, the boy who had cried in front of his old school, showed up. He sat down at the piano and picked out 3 notes, the same 3 notes, over and over again. "That's a good start," Mr. Patterson said. "I don't know how to play," Marcus said. "But you figured out those 3 notes," Mr. Patterson said. "That's the beginning of knowing how to play." Marcus came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the first month, there were 12 students in Mr. Patterson's music room during the free periods, and he had taught them enough that they could play "Lean on Me" together. It wasn't perfect. In fact, it was quite rough. But it was theirs. This is a small detail in the larger narrative of what happened at Riverside Learning Center. But it matters because it illustrates something crucial about what the students needed. They didn't need a better school. They needed to be seen. They needed to be known. They needed to be in relationships with adults who remembered them from one day to the next, who held expectations for them, who believed that they could make music and meaning. Kaisha was formally diagnosed with ADHD in September of her first year at Riverside Learning Center. The process began when Miss Tanaka noticed that Kaisha had significant difficulty with sustained attention in class, but could hyperfocus intensely on things that interested her. Miss Tanaka suggested an evaluation. Rebecca coordinated with the district's special education department. And for the first time in her educational career, Kaisha understood something about herself that made sense of her entire life. "I thought I was broken," Kaisha said to Miss Tanaka after she received the diagnosis. "Like, I thought I was just a bad person who couldn't pay attention. But it's not that. It's just how my brain works. And now I can get help." With appropriate medication and classroom accommodations, Kaisha's academic performance improved dramatically. But the more significant change was in her self-perception. She stopped seeing herself as a problem and started seeing herself as a person with a particular neurotype that required particular support. This shift from shame to understanding was transformative. By the end of her first year at Riverside Learning Center, Kaisha had maintained a B average. More importantly, she had started to re-engage socially. She had found a small group of friends. She was sleeping better. Her mother reported that she seemed happier at home. Tyler, the boy with untreated depression, followed a similar trajectory, though his path took longer. In his first semester, Tyler was almost mute in class. He would complete assignments, but showed no engagement. Ms. Fernandez, who had training in trauma and mental health, noticed something in Tyler's presentation that suggested depression rather than learning disability. She gently suggested to his parents that he might benefit from an evaluation by a mental health professional. His parents, initially resistant, they had not wanted to medicalize their son, eventually agreed. Tyler began seeing a therapist in December of his first year. In February, he was prescribed an antidepressant. The change was not immediate, but it was real. By spring, Tyler was participating in class discussions. By fall of his second year, he was tutoring other students in mathematics. These stories are not unusual. What is unusual is that a school system took the time and resources to identify and address these issues. In a larger, more efficient school system, a student like Tyler would continue to struggle invisibly, accumulating poor grades and behavioral referrals, at risk of dropping out or being pushed out. A student like Kaisha would be seen as a discipline problem and potentially funneled into the juvenile justice system. This was not because teachers in larger schools were uncaring, but because the systems were simply too large to allow for this kind of individual attention. But Rebecca persisted in naming the real cost of efficiency. She talked about the research on relational resilience. She cited Dr. Eleanor Hayes's longitudinal studies. She brought administrators to Riverside Learning Center to see what was happening, to meet the students, to understand the work. And some of them, when they saw it, understood something shifted in their thinking. One particular administrator, James Chun, who ran schools in a district about an hour away, became an advocate for a different approach. After visiting Riverside Learning Center, Chun made a decision. His district would not close any more schools. Instead, they would explore ways to make existing schools work better, even if they were underutilized. They would reduce class sizes in these schools. They would provide additional support services. They would invest in community rather than efficiency. It was a radically different approach, and Sean was prepared for pushback. But when he presented the fiscal analysis to his school board, he found something surprising. The long-term cost of maintaining smaller schools with better funded services was not, in fact, dramatically more expensive than consolidation followed by remediation of student problems. When you factored in the costs of behavioral health services, special education referrals, counseling, remediation, and the lost productivity associated with students who were disengaged or dropping out, the efficiency of consolidation became less obvious. Chun's district began a pilot program in which they would maintain 4 small elementary schools that served low-income neighborhoods, rather than consolidating them into 2 larger schools. They invested in additional support staff in these schools. They created smaller class sizes. They hired teachers specifically for their relational capacity, not just their credentials. 3 years into the program, the results were striking. Academic outcomes improved. Behavioral referrals declined. Teacher retention improved. Parent satisfaction increased. And the students, when interviewed, described feeling like they belonged. This was, in many ways, a simple solution. Of course, children do better in smaller, more caring environments with consistent adults who know them. This was not a revolutionary insight. It was something that every parent and teacher already knew. But it had been obscured by efficiency logic, by spreadsheet thinking, by the idea that education was primarily a fiscal problem that required fiscal solutions. By 2025, 7 years after Riverside Elementary had closed, something unexpected happened. The district superintendent announced a major policy shift. Going forward, the district would no longer pursue school consolidations based solely on enrollment decline. Instead, they would conduct community impact assessments before making any decisions to close schools. These assessments would include not just fiscal analysis, but also examination of community reliance on the school, consideration of the impact on displaced students, and evaluation of alternatives to closure. This was a significant policy change, and while it did not reverse the closure of Riverside Elementary, that building had been gone for years, actually demolished, and the land sold to a developer, it did change the trajectory going forward. And perhaps more importantly, it legitimized the concerns that had been raised about the original closure. Rebecca Santos, standing at a school board meeting where this new policy was announced, felt something shift inside her. The closure of Riverside Elementary had happened. The children who had been displaced could not get back those years. Miguel's fourth-grade year would always be marked by loss and disruption. Kaisha's elementary school experience would always include the trauma of being scattered into a school where she didn't belong. Marcus would always remember standing in front of an empty building, crying. But going forward, other children might not have to experience that. Other families might not have to mourn the loss of their school community. Other neighborhoods might not have to receive the message that they didn't matter. It was not a complete victory. It was not a reversal of what had happened, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement that the efficiency logic had been incomplete, that something real had been lost, that the cost had been higher than the spreadsheets had indicated. In the spring of 2025, Riverside Learning Center, as fourth cohort of students, now spanning grades 5 through 10, participated in a documentary film about the school and its history. The filmmaker, a young director named Sarah Kim, had been drawn to the story after reading Miguel's op-ed and the subsequent media coverage. She spent a year at the school, filming classes, conducting interviews, capturing the day-to-day reality of what happened there. A documentary, titled The Room Where They Know Your Name, premiered at a regional film festival and then at a national education film festival. It was reviewed positively by critics, but more importantly, it reached people in ways that academic research and policy papers could not. In one scene, a seventh grader named James, who had been displaced from Riverside Elementary in third grade and had struggled for 5 years before finding his way to the Learning Center, is sitting on the steps outside the building. He's talking about what it felt like to be lost in the larger school system. "I felt like I disappeared," he says. "Like I was a person before. I knew who I was. And then one day, none of that mattered anymore. I was just a number, just another kid in a hallway. And I got smaller and smaller until I couldn't even see myself anymore. And then I came here. And Rebecca knew my name on the first day. And I was like, oh, I'm still a person. I still exist." In another scene, Rebecca is walking through the building with a teacher who is new to the school. She's showing him around, and she pauses in front of a wall where student artwork is displayed. "I want you to understand something," she says. "Every piece of work on this wall is not here because it's the best work ever. It's here because it represents a child who is learning to believe in themselves. That's the curriculum here. Everything else, math, reading, whatever that happens too. But the real curriculum is learning that you matter." As the years passed, the students who had been the first cohort at Riverside Learning Center, the 73 students who had arrived in that first year, began to graduate and move into their futures. Some went to college. Some pursued trade schools. Some entered the workforce directly. But what was notable was that, despite their initial identification as at risk or struggling, their graduation rate and post-secondary success rate was significantly higher than comparable students who had remained in traditional school settings. By the end of the first year of Riverside Learning Center's operation, something unexpected was becoming clear. The 73 students who had been identified as struggling or at risk were actually thriving. Not all of them, to be sure. There were a handful who continued to struggle, who had more significant challenges that required more support than the school could provide. But the overwhelming majority showed improvement across academic, social, and emotional measures. More specifically, they showed improvement in the areas that mattered most for long-term well-being: sense of belonging, academic engagement, and behavioral stability. The district superintendent, the same Dr. Patricia Whitmore, who had announced the closure of Riverside 3 years earlier, was surprised by this outcome. She had anticipated that the Learning Center would serve a kind of triage function, a way to prevent the worst students from destabilizing the larger schools. She had not anticipated that it would actually be effective at helping students improve. She visited the school in May of that first year and spent the day observing classes. She watched Miss Tanaka teach mathematics using a combination of direct instruction and inquiry-based learning that kept students engaged. She watched Mr. Patterson's music class, where Marcus, who had been identified as having behavioral issues, was confidently leading a small ensemble through a piece they had written together. She watched Mr. Dorn work individually with a student on a science project, patiently explaining concepts until the student fully understood. She saw Rebecca in the hallway, greeting every student by name, asking about their lives, genuinely present. She observed the physical environment, the ways that the school was organized to be intentional, small, human-scaled. She saw the student artwork on the walls, actual, thoughtful work, not laminated posters or bulletin board decorations. She saw students who seemed, genuinely, to like being at school. At the end of the day, Dr. Whitmore sat down with Rebecca, and she said something that took Rebecca by surprise. "I made a mistake," Dr. Whitmore said. "When we closed Riverside, we didn't understand what we were closing. We thought we were closing an inefficient building, but we were actually closing a community." It was a moment of genuine realization, though what Dr. Whitmore did with that realization remained to be seen. The question of what had actually been lost when Riverside Elementary closed was more complex than it first appeared. On one level, it was simple. The school had been closed because it was underutilized. The building was expensive to maintain. The district's resources would be used more efficiently if they were concentrated in fewer, larger facilities. This logic was sound from a purely financial perspective. But on another level, what had been closed was an institution that served a particular function in the lives of children, families, and a community. Riverside Elementary was not just a place where reading and mathematics were taught. It was a place where children developed their sense of self in relation to caring adults. It was a place where teachers knew families across generations. It was a place where the neighborhood had physical representation where it mattered. It was a public commons, a space held in common by a community. The loss of that institution had consequences that were not immediately visible on academic metrics. The children who had been displaced experienced a rupture in their sense of belonging. They experienced the message, implicit in the closure, that their connection to place, to continuity, to community, was less important than efficiency. They experienced themselves, in the words of one student, as replaceable. And the research suggested that this message, absorbed at a critical developmental time, had lasting consequences. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, in her later work, had called this institutional trust trauma, the undermining of a child's trust in institutions to provide stability and care. And she found that it was surprisingly difficult to reverse. Even when students were moved to objectively better schools, with higher test scores and more resources, the trust had been damaged. It took, in her research, an average of 2 to 3 years in a genuinely caring institutional environment for that trust to begin to be rebuilt. This was what Riverside Learning Center was doing. It was not just providing a smaller classroom environment. It was providing an opportunity for trust to be rebuilt. It was saying, through every interaction, every consistent teacher, every student name remembered, every relationship honored, you belong, you matter. We are not going anywhere. In the second year of Riverside Learning Center's operation, the district added an additional cohort of 30 students. These were younger students from grades 5 and 6 who had been identified as vulnerable to future academic and social disengagement. Some of these students had been at Riverside Elementary before the closure. Others had come from other schools in the district and were simply showing early signs of struggle. Kaisha, now in 9th grade, became something of a peer mentor to these younger students. She had made a remarkable transformation from her first year to her second. She was not just academically successful now, but she had become genuinely engaged in school. She participated in class. She asked questions. She seemed to have reclaimed a sense of self that had been temporarily lost. When Rebecca asked her what had made the difference, Kaisha said, "When I got here, I thought I was broken. And then Miss Tanaka and everyone else made me believe I wasn't broken. They made me believe that my brain just worked different, and that was okay. And once I believed that, everything got better. But it's not just that they were nice to me. It's that they knew me. Like, they actually cared about me as a person. And that matters. This is the thing that the spreadsheets cannot capture. It's not the lesson plans, or the test scores, or the demographic data. It's the care. It's the consistent attention of an adult who sees a child clearly and holds space for that child's growth and belonging. It's the difference between being a number in a system and being a person in a relationship. By the third year of Riverside Learning Center, as operation meaning 6 years after the original school closure, something else began to happen. Former students of Riverside Elementary, now in high school or college, began to seek out the school. They wanted to volunteer, to work with the younger students, to be part of what was happening there. One of these was Miguel Reyes, who had been in 4th grade when Riverside closed. He was now a junior in high school at Central High, where he was doing well academically, but felt, he said, somewhat disconnected from school life. He had seen Kaisha posting on social media about Riverside Learning Center, and he had approached Rebecca about volunteering. Rebecca agreed immediately. She saw in Miguel's return something important. It was as if by choosing to come back to a space associated with his lost school, Miguel was healing something in himself. And by becoming the mentor to younger students at the Learning Center, he was creating a new positive relationship with Riverside. Miguel began tutoring in mathematics 2 afternoons a week. He worked primarily with students in the 5th and 6th grade cohort who were struggling with foundational skills. What he brought to the work was not just mathematical knowledge, but empathy. He understood what it felt like to be lost, to feel like you didn't belong, to struggle with attention and focus. He modeled for these younger students what it meant to persist through difficulty, to ask for help, to build relationships with teachers. More than that, when these students were interviewed years later about their high school experience and their sense of belonging and identity, they spoke with gratitude about Riverside Learning Center. They talked about how the school had saved them, how it had given them back a sense of self that had been lost when their original school closed. Kaisha, graduating with a 3.7 GPA and accepted to a state university to study psychology, said, "Riverside gave me back to myself. I was lost, and they found me. And now I know that I want to work with kids who are lost, because I know what it's like." Marcus, accepted into a competitive arts program at a liberal arts college, said, "Mr. Patterson gave me back music. He gave me the belief that I could create something beautiful, and that changed everything for me." Miguel, by then a junior in college studying education, said, "I'm going to be a teacher. I want to teach in schools like Riverside, where we know the kids, where we actually care about them as people. Because I've seen what that does. I've lived it." The broader policy implications of what had happened at Riverside began to spread through educational research and reform literature. Dr. Eleanor Hayes published her comprehensive book on school closures, which included extensive analysis of Riverside Learning Center as an example of how institutional repair could work. The book became widely read in education schools and by educators thinking about system reform. A particular chapter, titled "What We Lose When We Close Schools," laid out the research on the costs of closure. Hayes wrote about the disruption to student learning and mental health. She wrote about the loss of community infrastructure. She wrote about the particular impact on students with social-emotional vulnerabilities. But she also wrote about something less quantifiable, but perhaps more important: the disruption to what she called the foundational narrative of belonging. When we close a school, Hayes wrote, we disrupt a child's sense that they belong to a place, that they are known by the community, that there is a space in the world that is theirs. For children who have experienced other disruptions or losses in their lives, this can be particularly damaging. We may intend to improve schools through consolidation, but we may actually be harming the very children we aim to help. Hayes's book sparked significant conversation in policy circles. It was cited in debates about school closures in multiple states. It influenced the thinking of education policymakers who are reconsidering their consolidation strategies. But more importantly, it helped legitimate what families and communities had been saying all along, that schools were not just fiscal units or delivery systems for instruction, but communities that children belonged to. That closure had costs that couldn't be captured on a spreadsheet. That what happened in the walls of the school, the relationships, the sense of belonging, the identity formation mattered profoundly for children's development. The pandemic had forced a reckoning with what education was actually for. In the months when schools closed and shifted to remote learning, suddenly the academic content, the math lessons, the reading assignments seemed less central. What became clear was that school was also about connection, about belonging, about the development of social and emotional capacities. It was about children seeing themselves as valued members of a community. It was about relationship and presence. For the students at Riverside Learning Center, this reckoning had happened earlier. From the moment Rebecca opened that empty building and promised them stability and presence, she was already making a different bet about what education was for. She was saying, it's not primarily about efficiency or academic outcomes or fiscal responsibility. It's about knowing children. It's about believing in them. It's about creating a space where they can become themselves. This is not a radical or revolutionary idea. It's something that has been understood for centuries, something that great teachers have always known. But in the contemporary moment, an era of standardization, accountability metrics, efficiency logic, it had become almost revolutionary to insist on it. By 2026, 8 years after the original closure of Riverside Elementary, Rebecca Santos made a decision. She was going to step down as the director of Riverside Learning Center. She had received offers from universities to direct education programs. She had been asked to consult with districts across the country. She wanted to work at scale, to try to shift systems toward a more relational, less efficiency-driven model. But before she left, she wanted to ensure that what had been built at Riverside Learning Center would endure. She worked carefully with the district to transition the leadership to Mr. Dorn, a longtime teacher who had been with the school since its opening. She documented the school's approach, the daily practices, the relational structures that made it work. She worked with the district to make clear commitments about ongoing funding and support. On her last day, the entire school gathered in the multipurpose room. Students who had graduated came back. Parents came. Teachers past and present came. And in what felt like a benediction, Mr. Patterson played a song on his guitar, a piece that the first cohort of students had learned, "Lean on Me," which they had since taught to every cohort that came after. Rebecca stood in front of this gathering and looked at the faces of the students she had known and guided. She thought about what had happened here. She thought about the children who had disappeared into the larger school system after Riverside closed, the ones who had been scattered and lost. She thought about the ones who had found their way back to this building, who had been remade in an environment of genuine care. She thought about what it meant that rebuilding trust in an institution took years, that it required consistent presence and genuine relationship, that it couldn't be rushed or systematized. She thought about what this said about what we owe to children, about the cost of institutional abandonment, about the possibility of repair. And she said, her voice steady, "Thank you for teaching me what education really is. It's not in the standardized tests or the efficiency metrics. It's in the moment a child realizes that they are seen, that they belong, that they matter. That moment, that realization, that's what we're here for. That's what education is actually for." The story of Riverside Elementary and Riverside Learning Center is on one level a story about one school in one district in Pennsylvania. It is a story about particular children and particular teachers, and a principal who chose to believe that care and relationships were worth protecting. But on another level, it's a story about something much larger. It is a story about what happens to children when they are treated as units to be processed through a system, rather than as human beings to be known. It's a story about the costs of efficiency logic applied to human development. It's a story about the power of institutional care and the trauma of institutional abandonment. It's a story that has played out in various forms in thousands of school districts across America. Schools have closed, students have been displaced, communities have been fractured. The research suggests that this has consequences, not just for academic outcomes, but for children's sense of belonging, their trust in institutions, their development of identity. And it's a story about the possibility of repair, about the possibility that even after damage has been done, even after a generation of children has experienced loss and displacement, it's possible to create environments where trust can be rebuilt, where belonging can be restored, where children can come back to believing in themselves. This doesn't undo what happened. The years that Miguel spent lost in a larger school, the trauma that Kaisha carried for years before her diagnosis, the depression that Marcus struggled with in silence, these cannot be recovered. But it does suggest that repair is possible, that it's never too late to create a space where a child can be known, where they can belong. The students who came to Riverside Learning Center were not the lost generation because they could not be found. They were the lost generation because we as a society, as an educational system, had chosen efficiency over relationship, had valued the fiscal unit more than the human being. But they were found, they were known, they belonged, and in that belonging, they became themselves again. In the years that followed, as Rebecca Santos worked with districts across the country to rethink their approach to school closures and consolidation, she carried with her the stories of the students from Riverside. She carried the memory of Miguel's first day when he had seemed so small in a hallway with 400 other children. She carried the moment when Kaisha had understood, for the first time, that she wasn't broken. She carried the sound of Marcus playing music with people who believed in him. And she carried, most of all, a simple but profound understanding that what children need in order to thrive is not complexity or innovation or efficiency. What they need is to be known by adults who care about them, to belong to a community, to have a place that is theirs. This understanding began to ripple outward. Teachers in other districts started small learning communities within their schools, creating spaces where students could be known. Administrators began resisting the default impulse to consolidate, instead exploring alternatives. Parents started asking harder questions about school closures, about community impact, about what was actually at stake. It was not a revolution. It did not overturn the basic efficiency logic that governed American schools, but it was a shift. It was a movement toward thinking differently about what schools were for and what children needed. And it began, as many movements do, with one school refusing to let go, with one principal walking into an empty building and refusing to accept that a community didn't matter, with one generation of students who were determined not to be forgotten. The school without children, in the moment of its closure, seemed like an ending. But it was, in fact, a doorway to a different understanding of what education could be, what schools could do, what children deserved. And in a building in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, on any given day, if you walk into the space where Riverside Learning Center exists, you will see children being known, adults creating community, students learning to believe in themselves again. You will see, quite simply, the work of repair. You will see what happens when an institution chooses relationship over efficiency, presence over process, belonging over measurement. You will see the lost generation being found, again and again, every single day.